Thank you, Emily, for reading those intriguing, if not a bit confusing passages. So we are continuing in our project of reading through the story of the Bible. And I've got to say, we are really in the thick of it right now. We have come to the Mosaic Law, one of the hardest parts of all of Scripture to read through. And when I say the Mosaic Law, I mean it in a very specific sense today, in the sense that all of those lists of commandment after commandment, specifically in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, are given one after another in a kind of overwhelming way. And I don't know about you, but I find that I have a number of mixed experiences when reading this. It's kind of like a roller coaster ride of sorts for me. Because there are some passages that I find to be extremely inspiring when I'm reading through the law. Take, for example, this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 15, which says, "If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be." Now, I find that to be a powerful, inspiring passage. It calls us to go beyond the human instinct of just protecting our own and only worrying about whether or not we're hurting people, to remember that we are responsible for all of our sisters and brothers in our community, and to be willing to be generous. What a great passage to have in our scriptures. Or consider this passage from Deuteronomy 23, for example, that says, "Slaves who have escaped to you from their owners shall not be given back to them. They shall reside with you in your midst. In any place they choose, in any one of your towns, wherever you please, you shall not oppress them." I'm struck just by what a bold stance this passage is. It takes a stance on the side of those who are vulnerable. If people who have been persecuted come to you as refugees, do not turn them away. Open up your home, and don't even just give them the scraps at your table, but give them a real seat in your community. Boy, do I wish that the larger Christian community really took this passage to be authoritative as we're making decisions together in the United States. And then, even if you're reading through a text like Leviticus, as you're going through a difficult part like chapters 18 through 20, you'll come across a little gem like this that says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." A short line that has become one of the most influential religious passages in all of human history. So there are these passages that are just incredibly inspiring, but then I also find that at times I'm reading and I'm just confused. Some of the passages don't make a lot of sense to me. For example, from the one that Emily read for us this morning, there's this idea that, this law that any animal that has divided hooves and is cleft-footed and chews the cud, such you may eat. But among those that chew the cud or have divided hooves, you shall not eat. What is this about? Like this distinction feels pretty random to me. Why are some of these animals okay to eat and some of them not? Or another odd one from Deuteronomy 22, this line that says, "You shall not wear clothes made of wool and linen woven together." Some people have generalized this to say you shouldn't wear any kind of mixed fabrics, which of course most of us today have some kinds of clothes that have mixed fabrics in them. And it's hard to understand why anyone would have a problem with that. But then in addition to these, there are passages that there's no way to put it, troubling. It's hard to read them. It makes us uncomfortable. There are some passages, for example, that suggest that people should be excluded from the worship ceremonies and participation just because of some physical or medical ailment that they have. There are others that discuss women as though they are property It's especially difficult when these passages are talking about sexual assault, as though it's a concern between the woman's husband and her father, without giving any attention to how the woman herself, the victim in the situation, is experiencing or what she needs in response to such a crisis. And then there are passages that just straight up promote violence, that suggest that you should be violent in order to prevent crime from happening. Some that suggest some form of mutilation, some that suggest the death penalty, even for nonviolent crimes. And they do it with a kind of viciousness almost. This passage from Deuteronomy says, show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Meaning that if anybody takes something from you, you should take that exact same thing back from them. Now, fortunately, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, readers of the New Testament, we know that at least some of these commands no longer hold any authority for us, or that we have to listen to them. So, for example, this passage in Deuteronomy is one that Jesus specifically addresses in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, when he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, admittedly, this is a lot harder than the Deuteronomy passage, but it's one that accords better with our moral sensibilities. It makes us feel better about what the Bible's calling us to do. But the question remains, how far does this extend? Is it just this particular passage and that particular passage from the law that no longer apply to us? When Jesus came, was the entire law abolished for followers of Jesus? The New Testament almost feels like it's going in different ways on this, sometimes saying the law has become obsolete, but at other times suggesting that no, not even a single word of the law will become irrelevant for the people of God. Now, this is such a complex question that we are really going to have to spend our entire Facing Hard question session this afternoon wrestling with it. There's not really an easy, simplistic answer to how Christians ought to relate to the Mosaic Law. But I will at least share with you what has been one of the most influential approaches in all of Christian history. There was a scholar named Thomas Aquinas who, when reading the Mosaic Law, said, today, whenever we're reading one of these commandments, we should consider whether it is one of three different types of commandments. Whether it's coming from the moral law, which means that it's a commandment that God gives because it's the right thing to do, and this is universally true for all people across all time. And so, for example, most people would consider the 10 commandments set aside as being some of the most important of all to be a part of the moral law. Or whether it's a part of the civil law or judicial law, meaning that it was just a commandment that was given for the Israelites at that time because of the particular circumstances that they were in the wilderness, or things that they had to deal with that we don't have to deal with today. And maybe those aren't relevant anymore. Or whether it's a part of the ceremonial law, laws that were given in order to help them worship properly, which still have meaning for us, but which don't hold the same kind of weight since Jesus has come and changed our entire worship system. Well, I gotta say, I find this division to be a little too oversimplistic. I don't think that you can divide all of the commandments into one of just three categories. But I do think that there is value in looking at any of the commandments that we see and asking, what's going on behind this? What kind of commandment is it? What's driving it? I think that can be very useful for us as we discern how we ought to best honor God's law today. And so I think I might identify a few themes of my own that I see as being major themes that are influential throughout the Mosaic Law. Now, there are three of them. I don't mean to suggest that these are an alternative to Aquinas, the three and only three that everything can be reduced to. But it's helpful to think about to what extent these have influenced the particular commandments that we come across. So one of them is about proper worship, which aligns very closely with Aquinas's commandment, Aquinas's view of the ceremonial law. There are quite a few commandments that were given to set up a specific worship structure and style, so that the people of Israel could develop a very particular understanding of who God was. This actually takes up so much real estate among the Mosaic Law that it's going to be the focus of the entire sermon next week. And almost all of the readings next week are focused on various aspects of this worship/sacrificial system. But then there are some commandments that don't really address that because they're concerned with a different theme, with justice. This is a very important thing to God, that people are being treated equally, with dignity, with care and respect. Take, for example, this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 16, which says, "Justice and only justice shall you pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving." That claim that justice and only justice shall you pursue, I think highlights how important justice is to the law. It's one of the central pillars. God wants to ensure that every single person is cared for properly, that no one is neglected, and that the people of God is a community in which justice is done. But then I would say there are some commands that are out there that don't really have to do with this worship system or with justice. They have to do with a theme that we are not quite as familiar with or comfortable talking about, and that is holiness. This is a theme that comes up again and again and again in the Mosaic Law. I'm just going to give you one example here from Leviticus chapter 20, in which God says, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from other peoples to be mine." This is central to the identity of the people of God. In fact, we say, why has God even created a chosen people, set aside one people when God indeed loves all the people of the earth? Well, the answer from Leviticus and Exodus and many other places is that God wanted one people in particular to be able to emanate and reflect the holiness that God even has. Okay, well, I gotta be honest. Holiness is something that we're not as comfortable talking about for a few reasons. One of them is simply that it's a little bit more vague, confusing than justice is. Justice is a pretty straightforward concept for us. We know what it means to try to be just, to try to do the right thing and treat people well. It's not as clear what it means to be holy. Then, of course, there's the fact that holiness and its closely related concept of purity have become controversial lightning rods in the church today, specifically as they relate to the issue of sexual purity. There are some among conservatives who feel that this is a huge part of the biblical testimony, and that more progressive Christians just don't give it any heed at all. They don't care about it, that purity isn't even on their radar. And there are many people from a more progressive side, or even among conservatives, who have been hurt and shamed and damaged by this emphasis on sexual purity, because they've been told that maybe some of their thoughts or even their bodies have been contaminated, that they're fundamentally impure. So I want to just acknowledge this is a hard concept for us to talk about. And even as I am going through and discussing the various aspects of this, I imagine that for some of us, particularly those of us who have had a difficult experience in purity-focused churches, might feel some emotions being triggered as I even go through some of these terms. And this is actually one of the nice things about having a worship service on Zoom. If it gets to be too much, if you're feeling overwhelmed by it, you can just click the mute button and I won't even know. You can just wait till my face disappears during the song time and click it again. And honestly, that's okay. I won't be offended by it. But if you can, I would encourage you to try to write it out. Because ultimately, I believe that the only way to heal from scars like this is to try to understand what was really going on underneath the claims that people make. Now, this is not to say that I take a liberal view on sexual ethics. I actually have a very complex view of sexual ethics, and I'm not going to go into that now because it would derail us from our central purpose. For today, I want to think about the broader concept of holiness, of which sexual ethics is just one small slice. And so to try to keep us on track, I made the decision that I am not going to talk about or even think about the sexual component of holiness at all. Not because it's not important, but we're going to bracket it in the hopes that we can be more deeply grounded in this somewhat confusing concept that has such sway over this debate in the church and that plays such a significant role in the story of the Bible. So, what is holiness? Holiness is not something that's easy to define. It's kind of a big, broad category in and of itself. But maybe I'll start by saying that it is more of an aesthetic kind of value than justice is. Justice is a very logical thing, right? You're trying to figure out what's the most fair way to divide things. What is it that would treat each person with the kind of respect they deserve? Holiness is related to concepts like beauty and reverence and awe. It's something that you come across and it moves you. But even as I say that, we want to be careful because in our culture, we tend to think of beauty as being something that's fundamentally subjective. We say, yes, this happens to align with my personal tastes, and therefore I find it to be inspiring or beautiful. But that's not what holiness is referring to. Holiness refers to a kind of objective beauty or awe, something that is so powerful that it emanates out and touches even the people who may want to resist it with a kind of reverence due to its rightness, its inspiration. Now, holiness is also closely associated with the concept of purity. If something is holy, it is generally considered to be whole, pure, perfect, without flaws. And if something has imperfections, it's hard to see how that can be holy. Or maybe it's hard to see how that can even be in the presence of the holy, according to the biblical testimony. But purity, unlike holiness, has a certain element to it of vulnerability or fragility, right? Like if something is pure, then it's always at risk of being contaminated. If it's contaminated, then it loses its purity and it loses its access to holiness. So you think about water, right? Water is something that can just be so pure and lovely to drink. But if you go to a river that's polluted, all of a sudden you wouldn't want to put that water in your mouth. It's been ruined. Or you think about the way that people speak about precious jewels like gold or diamonds. And someone says, this is pure gold. This is diamond with a high level of purity. Well, people are going to inspect it under a microscope because if they can find even one flaw with it, then it dramatically drops in value. And so purity is connected to this sense of contamination, impurity. That something can come in and infect it and take away its pure status. And to be honest with you, contamination also has a kind of emotional, visceral component to it. It's connected with the emotion of disgust. So if I am going to my refrigerator expecting to have a snack of a nice fresh strawberry, and I open a Tupperware container and I find that the strawberries are covered in mold, my reaction is to have one of disgust, right? Like, oh, like this is not something that I want to put in my mouth. Or if I go to a room full of people, especially during a pandemic, and I'm having a good time, we're wearing our masks, we're kind of getting caught up in whatever's going on. But then a person without a mask comes in and just starts coughing and sneezing all over the place. Then all of a sudden I have a visceral reaction to it in my body, right? Like I don't want to be infected by this. Now, the examples that I'm giving here have been more medical, biological, chemical, and it's important to note that that these weren't exactly the same kind of categories that Jewish people would have had in the ancient world. I'd say that they're related, but they're not exactly the same. There was even a sense that people, but we still have even elements of this other type of purity today, this sense that maybe my reputation could be infected or corrupted by being around another person. That maybe my ethics, maybe a certain collection of something that I'm trying to gather could be made impure by dust or by whatever it is. Purity is something that we are always trying to protect against that which is vulnerable, and that is always associated with avoiding disgust. Now, you might think, why do we even need this language at all, right? Like to talk about people or things as disgusting, and I should point out that that the language that the Bible uses, you can tell whether it's talking about something that's pure, whether it's talking about holiness or justice, largely based on the language it uses, right? So if it's talking about something just, it's usually referring to how it affects people. Does it harm this person or not? When it's talking about holiness, it uses language like something is abhorrent, or maybe it's an abomination. Or there's even some extreme language that says maybe the land will vomit the people out, right? This is all language that's associated more with holiness than it is with justice. But it's hard to hear that language, right? Like nobody wants to be considered disgusting. Why do we even need to refer to people that way? Some of us might say, maybe we should just eliminate this entire concept of holiness, of purity, of impurity from our vocabulary altogether. Try to get rid of our sense of disgust. But it might be worth asking if that's really something we want to do. Because there are many ways in which disgust benefits us still as a society. Take, for example, the complaint that people often make that our children are becoming desensitized to violence. Certainly the case that when kids are watching violent movies, playing violent video games, when violent imagery is constantly around them, then they become more accustomed to it. But what are we actually saying when we're saying that? We're saying that kids, people in general, have a natural reaction of disgust when we see violence occur. And it's a deterrent to violence. And we want to preserve that reaction of disgust. It's a dangerous thing for the human race if that is taken away. I also want to give an example that thinks of disgust a little bit more broadly than thinking of something gross. I don't think that something being disgusting has to be gross. It's an instinct in you that's just fundamentally uncomfortable with something, right? The example that I give has to do with recycling. If you come from a background where you didn't recycle when you were growing up, it wasn't on your radar, and then somebody convinces you that it's really something you ought to do, well, then you're going to spend the first months, maybe years, really begrudgingly recycling, right? Like, okay, this is a hassle. I have to remember to sort out my trash, to put this here and that there. Maybe you find yourself out and about and there's nothing to do with your recycling, and so you end up carrying it around with you for a while, and it's a really frustrating experience. But if you've been doing it for a while, something funny happens. It goes from just being an ethic you remember to something that seeps down into your instincts. If you see a glass bottle sitting in a trash can, it bothers you. For some of us, it bothers us so much that we're just reaching in there and picking it out. We don't care. I know who you are. There are some of us that it bothers us that deeply, right? That is related to a sense of disgust. But on the opposite side of that sense of disgust is a real reverence, a holiness, a desire for the earth to be pure. And that is what motivates the opposite, the direction, the feeling in the opposite direction. I would even go one step further and suggest that it might be valuable for us to cultivate some disgust in some areas of our life. I think it would be great if we could cultivate a sense of disgust when people find that they are wearing clothing that has been produced by slave labor. Imagine that you have something on you and all of a sudden you realize that this shirt is in a sense contaminating you because it is making you complicit with a system of slavery. I feel like that might be a much more effective way to have people actually resist the system than having to make them make this logical decision every time about whether or not it's worth going to the extra store or making the extra investment. But that being said, I do want to acknowledge that being accused or called disgusting is deeply painful. Being called impure or unclean is painful. And the New Testament especially is very aware of this. In fact, one of the main things that Jesus was doing was going around and freeing people from this accusation that they are impure or unclean. But it's important to note that Jesus does this in two different ways, or we might say the New Testament more broadly does this in two different ways. Sometimes Jesus heals people from the disease, right? We might say that if somebody has been they have leprosy, or maybe they're a tax collector, right? And so they have this kind of corruption inside of them. Jesus actually heals them of these things, which suggests that it was appropriate for the disgust to be there in the first place. But in other cases, the New Testament suggests that the disgust itself is wrong. We find this especially in this passage that Emily read, this interaction with Peter, where Peter is having this vision and God is saying, here, eat these animals. And naturally, Peter, having been an observant Jew all his life, is repulsed, right? He says, no way, I can't do this. And he gets a stern rebuke. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. We can get it wrong. Sometimes our sense of what is impure or corrupt or unclean is deeply wrong. And there is a strong rebuke from God that comes from that. Now, in fact, even when we're using language as strong as abomination, the Bible acknowledges that there is some relativity in how people experience it. I'm intrigued by this passage from Proverbs that says, the unjust are an abomination to the righteous, but the upright are an abomination to the wicked. So the fact that we're having this sense of disgust doesn't mean that we're intrinsically right. It has to do with how we are oriented, with what is ultimately forming the positive vision of what's right and wrong. But then we come back to this question of, well, how do we sort through this? How do we know which of these commands we ought to follow and which ones are relevant and which ones might be harmful if we try to follow them today? And I would suggest that one of the keys is to ensure that two of these separate pillars in the law, this call to justice and this call to holiness, align. Because I really believe that a justice that is not informed by holiness ends up becoming a duty-driven, wooden, exhausting type of justice. And we need this aesthetic element of it, this positive vision of doing the right thing that infiltrates all the way down to our bones. So that evil isn't something that we have to resist, it's something that we genuinely don't want to do. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that our instincts of holiness align up with justice. Otherwise, we will count ourselves among the unjust who find that we are reacting negatively to the wrong things. For some of us, like Peter, it's going to take work. It takes work to reorient our reactions, our reactions to things which aren't actually bad. But if we want to be truly pure, if we want to be truly righteous, then I believe the only way to pursue it is through a holy justice. And with that, let's reflect on